You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, DNA ID, Malice, All Things Crime, and Riddle Me That. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is a Zodiac Speaking. A short-coded letter would arrive at the San Jose Police Department on November 21st, 1969, threatening a widow, resulting in police instituting 24-hour surveillance for the woman. But this was just the beginning, with the month of December becoming the busiest for authenticated and potential Zodiac correspondence known to this day. 5 communications would arrive in just 2 weeks. First, we'll concentrate on 2 correspondences mailed on December 10th and December 11th, 1969. The first has become known as the Forecast for Cancer communication, mailed from Sacramento to the Sacramento Bee newspaper. The second letter came to be known as the Forecast for Leo communication, which was mailed from San Francisco to the San Francisco Newspaper Printing Company, P.O. Box 3100, Rincon Annex, San Francisco. Both communications contained a page from a horoscope magazine, with pasted wording on each that included words and phrases such as Zodiac, Watch, FLT 3 of a Kind, FLT 555, Birds Fly South, and Magic Amulet, just to name a few. It's unknown if these 2 communications were mailed by the Zodiac, but a tantalizing connection may exist between the December 11th Forecast for Leo paste-up and the disappearance and eventual murder of Leona Roberts. On December 10th, 1969, 16-year-old Leona Roberts had left work to visit her boyfriend's house at 749 Tormey Avenue in Rodeo. A newspaper reported, quote, "Within 15 minutes of arriving at her boyfriend's apartment, a neighbor heard a girl scream. The neighbor called the sheriff, and soon after heard someone running down the stairs at the back of the apartment house, followed by the slam of a door from the direction of the downstairs apartment where Leona's boyfriend lived. When the boyfriend arrived, he saw Leona's red Volkswagen out front, but did not find her inside the apartment. On December 28, 1969, a man searching for driftwood on the beach at Bolinas Lagoon in Marin County found the nude body of Leona Roberts. The coroner estimated that she had been dead 4 to 7 days prior to recovery, and he theorized that she had been alive for 10 to 14 days following her abduction. Articles reported the coroner's theory that Leona had been kept bound for a period of time and died as the result of a viral infection, and then was disposed of by her abductor. It could be argued that the person who mailed the Forecast for Leo communication on December 11th used this as a play on words, supposed to be interpreted as Forecast for Leona Roberts. If this was the meaning, it would indicate that the author of these sinister communications, in which the pseudonym Zodiac was present, knew that Leona Roberts wasn't going to be killed immediately, hence the use of the word forecast. The sheer fact that the pseudonym Zodiac was present in a communication the same day as her abduction, followed by the heading of Forecast for Leo the following day, with her time of death not for at least 1 week, is a remarkable set of circumstances. Even more curious is the phrase, "Birds Fly South," pasted on the Forecast for Cancer communication. Leona Roberts was discovered at Bolinas Lagoon, approximately 12 miles from San Francisco. Bolinas Lagoon is a tidal estuary, approximately 1,100 acres in area, located in the West Marin region of Marin County, adjacent to the town of Bolinas. The Pacific Flyway is a major north-south flyway for migratory birds. These play on words appear to be in step with the mindset of the Zodiac. However, it must be stressed that neither of these communications can be categorically linked to the Bay Area murder of 5.
On December the 7th, 1969, a letter was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle with the so far unbroken 38-character code and message, which read, quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I just need help. I will kill again, so expect it any time now. There will be a cop. Then I will turn myself in, okay?" Despite the December the 7th communication being withheld from the newspapers, the subsequent Melvin Belli letter mailed on December the 20th would be authenticated as the Zodiac Killer by a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt that accompanied it. The Melvin Belli letter carried the same pleading message, stating, "Please help me," 3 times. Although not conclusive evidence to its authenticity, the following Fairfield letter, mailed to the San Francisco Examiner on December the 16th, 1969, began with, quote, "This state is in trouble. I will go for the government life." It contained the usual threats with a small 5-character code and was accompanied by a drawing of a knife and the written wording of "the bleeding knife of Zodiac." At the base of the correspondence, it contained a lengthy list of locations and cops the author wanted to kill, including 3 in San Francisco, 1 in San Jose, 6 in Vallejo, 8 in Napa, 3 in Fairfield, 9 in Sacramento, and 8 in Oakland. This letter was also withheld from the newspapers. Therefore, it was probably just another coincidence that 3 days later, on December the 19th, 1969, somebody claiming to be the Zodiac Killer just happened to target the San Jose Highway Patrol Station, delivering a payphone message to dispatcher Shirley Seary, stating, quote, "I am going to kill 5 of you officers and a family of 5 between now and Monday." An ominous message threatening to kill 5 cops in San Jose just 3 days after threatening to kill multiple cops in various locations within the second Fairfield letter, yet unreleased to the public. The payphone caller was very likely the author of the 2 Fairfield letters. In a previous podcast, it was argued that the August the 6th, 1969 San Francisco Chronicle article entitled "The Frenzy of San Jose Girl Slayer," covering the murders of teenagers Kathy Snoozy, 15 years of age, and Deborah Furlong, 14 years of age, was the likely inspiration for the Lake Berryessa attack just 7 weeks later. The August the 6th, 1969 Chronicle article would also have massive significance regarding the yet-to-be-mailed Monticello card on July the 13th, 1971, again intimating the Zodiac Killer's claim of murdering the Snoozy and Furlong teenagers. This will be extensively covered in a later podcast. So why would the payphone caller to the San Jose Highway Patrol Station deliberately choose the precise target of a family of 5, presumably in San Jose? If you look at the August the 6th, 1969 Chronicle article, you will notice the last 2 subheadings of callers and children. Under the banner of callers, it describes the frustration of Glenn Furlong, the father of Deborah Furlong, to the many annoying phone calls the family received, stating, "On several occasions people have called, and as soon as we answer, they hang up." He said his neighbours were very sympathetic, but complained he found some of his phone calls very disconcerting. Under the banner of children, it lists his remaining children of Glenn, aged 16, Floyd, aged 12, and Pamela, aged 11. With the Zodiac Killer having almost certainly read this San Francisco Chronicle article, it wouldn't be very surprising if the family of 5 threatened over the phone on December the 19th, 1969, had been Glenn Furlong and his wife, along with their 3 children of Glenn, Floyd, and Pamela.
If the author of the 2 Fairfield letters was a copycat, then he should have found it a rather simple task to replicate a neat and organized cipher, in similar fashion to the 408 cipher, which was freely available in multiple newspaper publications. A copycat should in theory be copying the style of previous Zodiac communications. Yet many people believe the Fairfield letters look nothing like previous Zodiac offerings. Therefore, we can either conclude that the author of the Fairfield letters was extremely bad at mimicking Zodiac letters, or he wasn't attempting to copy anything, because he was the Zodiac. The December 7th, 1969 code was quite frankly a disorganized mess in comparison to the extremely precise and symmetrical 408 cipher, so it should be fairly evident that no attempt was made in the name of imitating. On December 3rd, 2020, nearly 51 years later, David Oranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck solved the infamous 340 cipher. This not only ended a half a century of unanswered questions, but may very well have further corroborated the authenticity of both Fairfield letters. Rich would like to expand on this.
There is a character in the 340 cipher that looks similar to a capital I, with a dot to its left. In this section of the podcast, I will be referring to this as left eye, for simplicity. In the December the 7th, 1969 Fairfield letter, the Zodiac Killer began and ended his 38-character code with two prominent sections from the start and end of the 340 cipher, both of which contained the visible words of iron and death before any period 19 shift was applied to the 340 cipher. This may be another observation which confirms to the doubters the December the 7th, 1969 letter as an authentic Zodiac communication. Unless, of course, the 38 code hoaxer in the December the 7th Fairfield letter identified two passages of 4 and 5 characters from the undeciphered 340 cipher that just happened to accidentally find two English words after the 340 key was applied. In particular, the two which began and ended the 340 cipher. This hoaxer would also have to guess that by separating the prominent 8 characters that ended the final line of the 340 cipher, which included the near Zodiac pseudonym, into the 5 characters of A, I, K, left eye, plus, present on the bottom line of the 38-character code, he would be reducing these characters to create something meaningful. He apparently did. By separating these characters into the 5 visible at the end of the 38-character code, he created the word death, just like the solved 340 cipher. Druza, an excellent Zodiac researcher on many forums, pointed out the same thing, stating, quote, "The most curious and compelling feats are that the author isolated actual words in the 38-character code, most notably death, and that he refrained from copying Zodiac from the 340 cipher, which would certainly be expected of a hoaxer. In other words, he dismantled the near Zodiac element at the bottom of the 340 cipher while leaving left eye plus in place to form death as the final word on the 38-character code. This appears to show knowledge of the hidden message in the 340 cipher."
A few days later, postmarked December 20th, 1969, the Melvin Belli letter arrived at the prominent attorney's residence at 1228 Montgomery Street in San Francisco, containing a piece of bloody shirt from the taxicab murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of that year. Ominously, the font style used for the numbers on the envelope were identical to the numbers on the front of Melvin Belli's residence, indicating that the killer had possibly approached the home of Melvin Belli at some point. This was discovered by investigators at mkzodiac.com. The letter, which arrived at the Belli residence while he was out of the country, wished the attorney a Merry Christmas, while simultaneously pleading for help and fearing he was losing his control. It read, quote, "Dear Melvin, this is the Zodiac speaking. I wish you a happy Christmas. The one thing I ask of you is this. Please help me. I cannot reach out for help because of this thing in me won't let me. I'm finding it extremely difficult to hold it in check. I'm afraid I will lose control again and take my 9th and possibly 10th victim. Please help me. I am drowning. At the moment the children are safe from the bomb, because it is so massive to dig in, and the trigger mech requires much work to get it adjusted just right. But if I hold back too long from No 9, I will lose all control of myself and set the bomb up. Please help me. I cannot remain in control for much longer. The Zodiac was claiming he was searching for his 9th and possibly 10th victim in the Melvin Belli letter, suggestive that he had already secured victim number 8. Neither of the Fairfield letters had increased the victim count, previously set at 7 in the November 9th, 1969 bus bomb letter. So had victim number 8 been murdered between December 16th and December 20th? And could it have been Leona Roberts? The coroner estimated that she had been dead 4 to 7 days prior to recovery, and he theorized that she had been alive 10 to 14 days after abduction. But this was an estimate. She had been murdered between December 16th and December 20th. The Zodiac, by silently increasing his victim count during this period, may give us pause for thought.
The Zodiac Killer used similar phraseology in the Melvin Belli letter to the wording discovered in Frances Brown's apartment. A murder victim who was discovered with multiple knife wounds on December the 10th, 1945, at her 3941 North Pine Grove apartment in Edgewater, Chicago. In her case, a knife was found protruding from the neck, along with a bullet wound to her head. The killer had left a calling card in the form of a message written in lipstick on the wall of her apartment. It read, quote, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." Dubbed the Lipstick Killer, William Hirons was eventually convicted for the murder of Frances Brown, along with the murders of 43-year-old Josephine Ross, stabbed to death on June the 5th, 1945 in her apartment, and 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan, who disappeared from her home on January the 7th, 1946, and was later found dismembered in nearby storm drains and sewers. The writing discovered on the apartment wall of Frances Brown in red lipstick would again be mirrored approximately 4 months after the mailing of the Melvin Belli letter, when on April the 19th, 1970, the mutilated body of Robert Michael Salem was found in his 745 Stevenson Street, San Francisco apartment. Red writing was daubed on his apartment wall, this time written in blood. It read, "Satan saves, Zodiac," and was accompanied by an Egyptian ankh, a symbol that appears frequently in Egyptian tomb paintings and other art, often at the fingertips of a god or goddess in images that represent the deities of the afterlife. The day after Robert Salem's body was discovered, the Zodiac Killer would mail another communication to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper on April the 20th, 1970. What is extremely curious is that the murderer of Robert Salem in April left writing on his apartment wall in blood that somewhat mirrored the murder of Frances Brown, that in turn mirrored the Melvin Belli letter mailed just 4 months previously. The alternative is that the phraseology in the Melvin Belli letter was unintentionally similar to the wording on the apartment wall of Frances Brown, and no connection was intended. If the Zodiac Killer was responsible for the murder of Robert Salem, then once again he had left his calling card at the site of another attack, just like Lake Berryessa on September the 27th, 1969. On the same day the first Fairfield letter was mailed on December the 7th, 1969, somebody contacted Larry Lamotte, the news host of KTOK radio station in Oklahoma. The person stated that he had left California because it got too hot for me. The host said he did a very good impression of the caller to the Jim Dunbar show. On October the 21st, 1969, the day before the Jim Dunbar show, a caller to the Palo Alto Times newspaper threatened to pick off kids as they got on the school bus. This person also said he left San Francisco because I'm too hot there. This brings me back to the question of the Oakland PD call requesting either Belli or F. Lee Bailey to appear on the Jim Dunbar show. Were all these calls linked by phraseology saying it's too hot for me? and 2 were in close proximity to each other. Were they all Eric Wheel, a hoaxer, or Zodiac? Now, wouldn't we expect a hoaxer to mimic the Zodiac Killer and focus specifically on San Francisco and the Bay Area? Why would a hoaxer want to bring Oklahoma into the fray and redirect the focus 1,700 miles away? Does this lend credence to the notion of a Zodiac Killer who had some personal connection to Oklahoma or the mid-states of America? Now, I know we talked many times on the forum about a connection to a British person, but are there anything in the letters that you consider may give away the location of the Zodiac Killer in America, such as Fiddle and Fart?
You know, I know a lot of people have sort of looked at the language, the writing of a lot of the letters, the confirmed letters and some of the unconfirmed letters, and drawn conclusions about where someone was from. I remember in Robert Graysmith's book, Zodiac, he thought the term fiddle and fart around originated in the Texas area. It's not a commonly used phrase, for example, that specific phrase, but it's interesting where people look and try and find stuff. For me, I don't see anything specifically that would point to Zodiac having a tie in Oklahoma. There's other instances that we'll be talking about eventually where in different parts of the country there are possible unconfirmed Zodiac letters in Atlanta, in Albany, New York. So it's possible that as this Zodiac Killer news started to spread across the country, that people in different areas, to get some attention or to play pranks or to scare someone, may have used that Zodiac moniker to their advantage, even if it wasn't the real Zodiac. But I don't know. I haven't seen anything myself, in my opinion, that says that any of the stuff outside of California could be the real Zodiac. I mean, it's definitely possible. But as far as Eric Wheel or someone like that perpetuating it outside of California, I don't see what their advantage would be. As you mentioned, if they want people to think they're really the Zodiac, you think they would confine that to California. But as I said, someone that wants to play a joke or scare someone in another state, if Zodiac was making big news and people were becoming aware of that, they could do that to scare them or get some attention.
Yeah, you mentioned Atlanta there because possibly the Zodiac Killer sent a communication from Atlanta. But if we look at the Lake Berryessa police report, there was also a mention of Colorado. He was an escaped convict from Colorado. And also you have the Christmas cards sent to Donna Lassie's sister, Mary Pilker, which was from South Dakota. And I was thinking that maybe the Zodiac Killer, because we've also connected him to New York, or thought he may have connections to the New York area. These are all mid-state areas in America that he may have passed through on his way to New York.
Yeah, we certainly shouldn't dismiss any of those just out of hand and say they're not Zodiac. They certainly could be. Maybe he really was traveling for whatever reason on a family vacation, or he really did want to get out of the Bay Area because he did think the heat was on him and he wanted to just step back for a while. So to just dismiss them out of hand would be irresponsible. I think we definitely have to consider them as possibly being from Zodiac.
Now, we have 2 communications that may or may not be connected to Leona Roberts in December, discussed in the intro. 4 months later, on April the 20th, 1970, in the My Name Is letter, which arrived at the Chronicle, the day after the murder or suicide of Pat Tan, found hanging near Bootjack Campground on Mount Tamalpais. The April the 20th letter stated, "I hope you'll have fun trying to figure out who I killed." Pat Tan's body was found 2.5 miles from the location where Leona Roberts' body was found at Bolinas Lagoon. 2 years later, another attempted murder suggested as Zodiac was Isabel Watson along Pine Hill Road, which Ken Narlow thought was more than a 50% chance to be Zodiac. The Pine Hill Road location runs extremely close to the murder sites of Pat Tan and Leona Roberts. Could Isabel Watson have ended up in the same area had she not escaped? Would you like to elaborate on the Isabel Watson crime, Mike, or if any of these crimes may be connected?
The one thing we know about Zodiac is he's capable of murder. So any of these cases where we see a murder, an attempted murder in that general vicinity of California could be Zodiac because we know he's capable of doing that. At the same time, I like to point out there's a lot of bad people doing a lot of bad stuff in California at that time. There were numerous serial killers and numerous people committing crimes, and Zodiac got blamed for a lot of it, and the name Zodiac came up a lot. But I think Ken Narlow, specifically in the instance you're talking about, had some reasons to suspect Zodiac. I think the physical description was close. So I think that's one to me that sort of jumps out as possibly being Zodiac. And you're right, had she wound up in his car being taken away someplace, maybe she would have wound up in that other location that was close to the others. So we can't rule that out as being a possible Zodiac crime. I know, as you mentioned, Ken Narlow thought there was a better than 50% chance that it was.
With the Leona Roberts murder, we have the communications timed at exactly the same time as her abduction, with the pseudonym Zodiac attached to the communications, which was similar in nature to, which we will discuss next, the Robert Salem murder, where Zodiac was scrawled on the wall. And in 1986, which is a bit further away, we've got the Sochow and Salee murders, where there is a letter connected to these murders. So do you think these crimes have a little bit more importance in the fact that we have the pseudonym Zodiac attached to all of these crimes? Or do you think there were just too many hoaxes around?
I'd like to say that some of them could be Zodiac, but I think it's likely that not all of the ones that are mentioning Zodiac or people are bringing up as possible Zodiac crimes are, again, because he was so notorious in that area. Anyone that wanted to shift attention from themselves might throw the name Zodiac out there and make it look like it was Zodiac. So I think it's impossible to really pick through and determine which of those crimes might be Zodiac and which ones might not. I try to stick to the canonical victims that we know for sure are Zodiac related. But it's hard to ignore that there are other cases that have similarities. So, I think, again, it would be irresponsible to not at least consider them as possibly being Zodiac. One that we haven't talked about, one we haven't mentioned, but there was a couple that was killed in 1967 in Alameda County that had all the hallmarks of Zodiac in many ways. That's one that didn't really get attention, and there were no letters mailed from someone claiming to be Zodiac. But, if you look at the crime itself, you have a victim out in the Lover's Lane area. It was very similar to the Lake Herman Road murders. So I tend to look at more of the crimes just as opposed to someone slapping the name Zodiac on them. And I try and see, is this how Zodiac is known to act? If this is a similar MO, then I put a little bit more weight in that than someone just throwing the name Zodiac out there as being connected to it.
And do you believe the couple, Melina and Rodriguez, were Zodiac victims?
I go back and forth on that. I look, again, we know the Zodiac victims were confirmed to be younger Caucasian victims for the most part, without the exception of Paul Stein, who was a little bit older. But at the same time, they were parked in a secluded area, and Zodiac might not know who he was walking up on if he was the killer and killed them, and found out after the fact maybe they were a little bit older than he would normally target if he was their killer. Again, the MO is very similar, but there are a lot of bad people out there doing bad stuff in California at the time, so it could have been any number of explanations as to someone else killing them. Although it's interesting where they were found, where they were killed, is very close to where Zodiac mailed some of his letters from.
And what's your opinion on the December the 10th and December the 11th communications? Because they were very cryptic in nature with pasted material on a horoscope, which these two communications were unreleased to the public. And yet later, Zodiac did release pasted postcards, which he mailed to the newspapers. So do you think this adds more validity to these two communications in December?
Well, I think Zodiac was creative, and I've sort of given up on trying to figure out why he wrote letters in one way and sometimes and did them different in other instances. Like the Halloween card to Paul Avery is very creative. We know he used some abilities on there to sort of design it, if you will, a little bit. So I wouldn't put it past him to just suddenly reach out using cutout magazine articles or newspaper articles. And again, I'm trying to get inside a killer's head as to why he would write so many letters by hand, but then decide to write these other letters send these other letters that are cut out pieces. It could also be, I want to also look at the possibility that it's a hoaxer and they don't know, they haven't seen Zodiac's handwriting, or they don't know how to copy it, but they want people to think they're Zodiac, and they would put some articles clipped together and send it as an ominous thing from Zodiac, even though it might not be from Zodiac. There's been some debate on some of the letters that you're mentioning being from Zodiac or being confirmed to be Zodiac, but I think that's still an open topic in my estimation.
In the next communication at the end of, December the 20th, in the Belli letter, the killer had effectively already insinuated he had claimed 8 victims because he was searching for a 9th and 10th victim in this letter. In view of the fact 3 of the 4 attacks were couples, what do you think of the John Franklin Hood and Sandra Garcia murders on February the 21st, 1970 in Santa Barbara by knife? And why do you think this crime is rarely covered compared to the Dominguez Edwards murders in 1963, especially when this is under the umbrella of the Zodiac timeline?
To me, the Hood-Garcia case has a little bit more of the hallmarks, in my opinion, of being related to possible activity by the Manson family. I personally don't think the Manson family had anything at all to do with the Zodiac case, but if you look at the crimes themselves, they seem to be a little bit of a different MO. So, and again, we haven't talked about the Dominguez Edwards case, which is a possible Zodiac case down there that we're definitely going to talk about in a future episode. But that's interesting, that connection there of the stabbing, because as we've seen, like at Lake Berryessa, we saw how Zodiac walked up with a gun, was able to control them, was able to stab them after he had control of them and secured them. You can wonder if that same thing happened to Hood and Garcia. How were they controlled? Was it one person with a gun that got them under control, or was it a group of people? The one thing we know was operating down there at that time was the Manson family. They were in that area. They were known to frequent that area. So a lot of people have sort of looked at that. If the Manson family was involved in their slayings, I don't think it was connected to Zodiac in any way, but that's just my opinion. I know there's people out there that are interested in the Manson family being involved. But correct me if I'm wrong, they weren't bound, were they?
There's no mention of a binding in this case, other than the fact they were stabbed with a bone-handled 4-inch blade, and this blade was discovered under the blanket at the crime scene.
Yeah, so
buried in the sand.
Yeah, now that, again, that has some similarities to Lake Berryessa, but short of the bindings, unless they just didn't release it, they were bound. That would be a little bit more compelling to me to say, hey, maybe these are connected because they were bound. But again, I go back to there's so many bad people in California committing awful crimes during that time. It's just impossible, but it is worth comparing to crimes like Berryessa.
Okay, here's another little connection in the sense of the December letters. Zodiac may have sent 3 codes from Fairfield, including one in 1971, which was the 148-character cipher. Is it possible he had a second property or a basement residence or a lockup in Fairfield where he built his bomb? In January of 1970, Suisun City, which has marshes and the Suisun Slough, suffered major flooding. The Zodiac Killer wrote 3 months later in the April the 20th letter, I have killed 10 people to date. It would have been a lot more except that my bus bomb was a dud. It was swamped out by all the rain we had a while back. Suisun City sits alongside Fairfield. So is it possible he could have been referring back to Fairfield where he had mailed 2 communications in December, considering the flooding in January?
I think it's definitely possible. I think Zodiac may have tipped his hand or given clues to investigators that he didn't necessarily mean to do. He was just providing material for his letters and maybe didn't think through all of the things that he said. At the same time, he was known to say things sometimes that probably weren't true. So he could be misdirecting them, saying, hey, in my basement here, he might not have had a basement. But at the same time, it's Fairfield. It's right there in Solano County. So anyone sending a letter from there claiming to be Zodiac, I think you have to give the attention to and try and diagnose whether it was. What's interesting, and I think people can go to our websites and see these letters. To me, when I looked at that letter, I didn't think it looked at all like Zodiac's writing. And I go back to, hey, if you want people to think you're Zodiac, wouldn't you try and make the writing look like Zodiac's? But since it looks so different, I also wondered, and I think you wondered the same thing, could Zodiac have done these without caring whether it looked like his old things? Or, maybe he was just messing with police, trying to switch up his handwriting a little bit. And I think you can probably elaborate on that too.
Well, I was going to say, it's quite easy for a hoaxer to have mimicked the Zodiac Killer based on the cryptograms and the communications he'd previously sent. I could have done it, and I'm sure you could have done it. So the fact this guy didn't do it may suggest he was a Zodiac Killer and didn't care whether people believed he was a Zodiac or not, because he was.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. And why he would mess around and change his writing and change his styles, we can only guess at. But it seems definite that there was a different look to them. And again, I'd be speculating as to why that is. But it's also interesting that they seem to rule them out as being unconfirmed and not being confirmed. So something about those letters, the question ones at least, something didn't fit the bill in the minds of the investigators. Something was off about them, I think. And we're not professional document examiners, obviously, but something about those letters just didn't seem to suffice as being from Zodiac. So we can question what that is.
But also we covered about Martin Lee, Chief Inspector Martin Lee, who painted a portrait of the killer, suggesting he was a person who was scruffy in his writing, yet his codes and ciphers were neat and tidy, and gave the impression he knew who the Zodiac Killer was based on his correspondence. So it would be right up Zodiac Street to then send in a communication with his cipher completely scrawled all over the place, as though to say, you don't really know who I am, because I'm quite prepared to change.
Exactly, and that would be another way to make the police run in circles. I do remember, and it's been so long since I looked at it, but I remember someone commenting, oh, that's just old so-and-so sending another fake Zodiac letter. I think the police had, obviously, copycat letters and hoax letters, and from what I remember, there seemed to be one person that might have done multiple ones because the police sort of figured they were from him and didn't give any credence to them being from Zodiac.
Another thing about the two Fairfield letters, they can be compared to the Halloween card, which is yet to be mailed. The second Fairfield letter contained a 5-character code, followed by 4 small crosshairs around larger crosshairs, mimicking the yet-to-be-released Halloween card. Tahoe27, a contributor on your forum, showed that by fire, by knife, by rope, by gun, around the Paradise and Slaves cross seemed to parallel the Tim Holt comic book from 1952. But the phrasing in the comic was death by fire, death by rope, leading me to conclude that this may have been the word intended for the 5-character code in the Fairfield letter. Also, by fire, by rope, by knife, and Paradise and Slaves are 38 characters in length, like the code in the first Fairfield letter, and can be placed neatly and orderly in that position on each line of the Z38. So both the Z38 and Z5 can be explained using the Halloween card. This may be a coincidence, but it opens up the question of when or if he may have been inspired by the death wheel. The Zodiac had used a gun, a clothesline, stroke rope, and a knife by the December of 1969. So it seems unusual that the Kathleen Johns abduction that we will discuss in the next podcast, that the perpetrator seemed unnecessarily to burn her vehicle. What are your thoughts on the comic book connection and whether he was driven by a comic book fantasy or by some warped sense of religion?
Well, to me, that comic book find was a fantastic find. That was, in my mind, there's no doubt that he was inspired by that. It would be too coincidental. So that immediately told me that Zodiac was a comic book fan or had read comic books at least, because I just felt that there was no way that was a coincidence. And that could maybe tell us a little bit about who he is as a person, about some of his interest. And to me, I always felt it was a little bit juvenile of him to draw on a comic book. So maybe he's someone that's sort of stuck at a younger age, developmentally, not fully developed as an adult, since he draws on some of that stuff that kids are interested in. So I think that find was a good find, and anything that sort of springs off of that comic book, as far as Zodiac's related, is worth looking into.
Now, the Rota Fortunae, or death wheel, was common back then. Do you think the Zodiac was inspired specifically from that comic book?
I think he was. I think just if you compare that Halloween card that he sent to Paul Avery and just put it next to the wheel, it's just like he's reading right from it and creating this card. So to me, I have no doubt that he read that comic book.
Now, what you've just said leads me to another question, in that many people believe the Zodiac Killer to have deliberately misspelled his letters to disguise his intelligence. Many suspects and books have depended on analysing these letters, showing his interest in radians, his interest in comic books and films, the Mikado, and all exhibiting a narcissistic character trait, supposedly from his basement residence where he was flooded out. If the Zodiac Killer can disguise his handwriting, why couldn't he disguise everything else? And so the picture we've got of a Zodiac Killer and his interest in the Mikado and such like, he was actually completely the opposite person.
You bring up a good point. Perhaps he, in his everyday life, he's this mild-mannered, professional, mature, but at his root, when he's Zodiac, when he's this arch villain, he could take on a totally opposite personality and show a totally different side of himself. So I think you bring up a good point that what he shows us as Zodiac may not be who he is in his everyday life.
This would mean that every book and everything ever thought on the Zodiac Killer based on his writings could be completely wrong. If he had written about the sound of music and used some phraseology from that film, we'd all be thinking he was a Julie Andrews fan now.
Yeah, exactly. But at his core, even if he doesn't show it to the world in his everyday persona, he is interested in that stuff, or he just decided to go out of his way to say, I'm going to use stuff that I have no interest in to make this villain character up, and I'm going to take from this and from that, and just stuff he has no interest in, so it can't be tied back to him. That's an interesting way of looking at it, because if you go looking for a suspect who's into the Mikado, who lives in a basement, all these different clues that we've gotten, maybe the real person that was Zodiac, none of that stuff would show up, so you would sort of overlook him. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac. Or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site, zodiacciphers.com, or by going to Mike's site at zodiackillersite.com.
We'd like to take a moment to thank all the people that have reached out to Rich and I to say congrats on starting Zodiac Speaking, or to compliment us on the podcast or the material we've covered so far. We really appreciate all the support, and if you'd like to help us grow, please take a minute to rate us and leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. You can also recommend Zodiac Speaking to your friends. We'll be doing a special Q&A episode coming up, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to us on social media. Or you can email us questions directly at zodiacspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. As we wrap up this episode of Zodiac Speaking, Rich and I would like to play a preview for you for a really good true crime podcast called Morbidology.
Morbidology is a weekly true crime podcast hosted by me, Emily G. Thompson, author of Unsolved Child Murders, Cults Uncovered, and co-author of Unsolved Murders, True Crime Cases Uncovered.
911 emergency. My son shot my husband. I need an ambulance. He's bleeding.
Using investigative research combined with primary audio, including 911 calls, interviews, and trial testimony, Morbidology takes a look at some of the world's most heinous murders.
Do you know why you're here?
For a home invasion gone terribly wrong.
Listen to Morbidology today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you're listening.